how did you and your family get involved in Young Life? How did all that happen?
Okay, Jim Rayburn was a seminary student in Dallas, and he came to my father and my Uncle John and talked with them about an evangelistic campaign that he wanted to put on in Dallas. It was actually a tent meeting. Young Life began in a tent. It really wasn't a club ministry then. It was an evangelistic campaign. And he asked my father and uncle to help subsidize this evangelistic campaign that he wanted to do. And they did. So he set up a tent across the street from Fair Park in Dallas and put out a big sign in front of it that said, "Young Life Campaign, Hear Jim Rayburn." That was the sign. I can still see that sign. And we did. We heard Jim Rayburn, and hundreds of kids in Dallas did too. He was an amazing communicator, and that was the first time I ever heard the gospel really in a way that I could understand it or appreciate it. But it all started in a tent. This was during the Second World War, and it was a very difficult time for a lot of people, because a lot of the young people then went off and served in that war, and many of them didn't return. But that's the way Young Life began. It began in this very interesting way. The club stuff came later.
Now, I know that he did those tent campaigns in the summer of 40 and also 41. Were you involved in both of those?
No, only one. He started one in Houston, and that would have been the one in 40.
Right.
This was the one in 41 in Dallas. Okay. Yeah.
Now, Char Meredith, in her book, talks about your dad and uncle. If I remember this right, I may not have it right. It seems like they came upon Jim as he was setting up the tent. That's how they first noticed him, and they literally helped build the benches, or set up the benches that he was going to have the meeting in. Does that ring any bells with you?
Yeah, they were involved in the physical construction of the place. It wasn't quite that they just happened to see him. He had made an approach to them because they were pretty well-known businessmen in Dallas, but yes, they did go out and physically set up the benches. They built wooden benches for this thing. I mean, it was your typical Southern evangelistic, campaign. In those days, there were jillions of them. People would, come through with their Christian horses and all kinds of stuff. So Jim just he just rode on that wave, but he did it all for kids, and it had that very special touch.
What did your dad and uncle like about him? How did they connect with him?
Well, both my father and Uncle John were very active and responsible members of their churches, mainline denominations there in Dallas. It wasn't that they were unchurched, but this was the first time either one of them had heard the gospel presented in a fashion like Jim could do it. And they were captivated with that, and they wanted us to be there to hear it too. So my brother and I went there every night and listened to Jim talk.
Do you have any idea how Jim made the connection to them? Were they involved with Dallas Seminary at all, or do you think he just was going out soliciting some support?
Yeah, they were supportive of Dallas Seminary. They were very active in affairs involving youth in Dallas, well-known people there. And my uncle, John, taught a large Sunday school class at First Pres in Dallas. And he was interested in Jim as to how Jim might impact some of the kids that he was teaching at that time. My father, the same, was very active in scouting in Dallas, and so it all just kind of fit together. Here was this young man who seemed to have a great touch with young people, and they wanted to get him involved.
Well, when did you first meet Jim, and what were your first impressions?
I first met him at that tent, and my first impressions were, I never heard anybody talk like this. His sense of humor is what captivated me. I wanted to go each night to just hear him tell these stories, and because I'd never heard a Bible story told with humor. You know, everything was pretty formal, and when Jim would talk about the changing of the water to wine, I remember that's the first one I heard him say. Talking about John 2 and how Jesus took this old West Texas brackish well water and he turned it into this fine wine, and man, we were just captivated. And all the humorous touches and the beautiful ways that he just gave us a picture of Jesus, who he is.
Where do you think that came from?
Jim was in a class in seminary that radically impacted his life. And he studied under Dr. L.S. Chafer at Dallas Seminary. And I think a lot of it came out of Chafer's teaching, particularly in the whole area of grace. That was his, really his great contribution to theology, was that grace teaching. And I think a lot of it came through that class. But I also believe that Jim was uniquely called and gifted. And there's a real mystery about where some of that came from. I think it was just God's blessing for all of us through a man, through an individual.
It is interesting, and of course I've been following or observing Jim's life, so to speak, since I was a high school kid and read It's a Sin to Be a Kid. But if ever there was someone who was made by God to do something, it would seem to be Jim Rayburn.
Yeah, it was a unique call.
Yeah.
No question about it. I don't know how history will record this man, but I would have to say he brought a style, and he brought a concentration upon the person of Jesus that was absolutely unique and I think remarkable.
You have walked in evangelical circles for quite a while and have probably known many of the architects of that. So
some of them.
You're as good a person to figure that out as anybody. What do you think how do you think history should remember Jim and his contributions?
As a very human individual, not in any sense to be deified. Sometimes we get these great images of people and they're almost unrealistic. Jim was very human. He had faults like we all do. But the one thing about Jim was a passion. He had a passion for Jesus. And I think that's the way the man should be remembered, that he was absolutely determined that every kid would have a chance to be exposed to the grace of Jesus Christ. And he devoted himself to that. But I believe that was his contribution, was his passion for Jesus and for young people.